Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Nature Unbound episode. Today, we're talking about the first part of Chapter 7, the cycling of elements through ecosystems. Now, I'm a biologist, and we are taking field biology. When I think of biology or living organisms, I think of things that you can see, things like trees and things like even you and I. All right, these are objects that we can visibly see. But today, I want to completely transform the way you look at living organisms. Today, I want you to look at them as just a giant collection of atoms. So all of these little dots represent atoms, and the key concept number one is all matter is composed of atoms. Includes dead matter or non-living matter such as earth and rocks and water and air, but of course it also includes all living things are composed of atoms at their bare bones. Now atoms come in a bunch of different flavors, and we call these flavors elements. As of the time of this recording, there are 118 elements on the periodic table. So I'm going to ask you to memorize all 118 of those elements. Just kidding. This is not a chemistry class. This is a biology class. And the cool thing about biology is we really only care about 5 of these elements or 5 of these flavors. The flavor in black is called carbon. The flavor in white is called hydrogen. The flavor in red is oxygen. The flavor in blue is nitrogen. And the flavor in orange is phosphorus. So these are standard colors used to represent these 5 different elements. And I will be using these colors throughout today's lesson. Using just these 5 elements, you can create pretty much all of the major molecules that are important for life. 18% of your body is made up of carbon. 10% of your body is made up of hydrogen. 65% of your body is made up of oxygen. 3%, it's getting smaller, is made up of nitrogen. And then phosphorus, along with everything else, makes up about 4% of your body. We're going to focus on these 5: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Let me throw some molecules at you, see if you can guess what they are. Here one is with 1 red atom and 2 white atoms. See if you can guess what this compound is. This is water, also known as H2O. Here's another one. This is 1 black molecule with 2 red molecules. What compound is this? This is carbon dioxide, also known as CO2. Here one is, it's kind of a boring one. It's just 2 red atoms. So what molecule is this? This is oxygen. Specifically the oxygen that's in the air that we breathe. It's O2. Here's another one. A bit more complicated. What molecule do you think this is? So that's a tough one to get, but this is glucose, also known as C6H12O6. But you recognize this from our flow of energy series. My favorite molecule of all time looks something like this. Now, this is the most complex one of all of them that we've looked at so far. Notice it has carbon in it, it has hydrogen in it, it has oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus in it. This is one of the most important chemicals of life, and it is called DNA. This is just one of those nucleotides that forms the long chain of DNA that is so critical to life. So now you can see how these 5 elements can combine in so many different ways to form the important molecules such as water, carbon dioxide, oxygen, glucose, and even DNA. So the funny thing about matter and atoms is that they can never be created or destroyed. What you start with is what you end with. That cannot be changed. Even though sometimes it looks like you are destroying matter. Think of, for instance, a fire. So suppose you're sitting at a campfire, and at night you throw a couple of big logs on that fire. When you come back the next morning, those logs are going to be gone, completely gone, and you'll just have a small pile of ashes left over. So it looks like you just destroyed these atoms that were in those logs. They're gone. But you didn't actually. They are just changed in forms. Wood is made up primarily of carbon and hydrogen. It's rearranged in all these different ways in the wood, but it's primarily carbon and hydrogen. And the oxygen is coming from the air. So when you light that wood, that's the heat that you need to start the fire. That oxygen starts combining with the hydrogen and carbon in the wood, and it starts burning. As it burns, it releases stuff, such as CO2, carbon dioxide, H2O, water. These are both released into the atmosphere, the water as water vapor. Also, since this is a fire, it's releasing energy. As it's going through this chemical reaction, it's releasing energy in the form of light and heat, which is usually what we care about when we're making a fire. The stuff that's left over is this non-combustible ash. These are the atoms that didn't burn up in the fire. But as you can see, the majority of the wood actually gets transformed into these other molecules, carbon dioxide and water vapor. Pretty neat, isn't it? So this is what we mean when matter cannot be created or destroyed, only changed in form. And there's actually a law about this. It's called the law of conservation of matter. So take this one step further. This means that all of the matter, all of the atoms that we are using right now in our bodies have been used in the past by other organisms in their bodies, and they just keep getting recycled. So for instance, that T-Rex that lived in the past, it used these same 5 elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Here we are today using those same 5 elements, some of them probably used by the T-Rex: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Who would have thought that T-Rexes were such fantastic recyclers? I don't know about you, but I think this deserves 2 big thumbs up. When you start to think about this on the ecosystem level, how do these elements cycle through an ecosystem? Great question. We can think about it in these 4 different areas. There's the water part, there's the earth part, or the land, the rock, the soil, and there's the atmosphere, and then there's all this living stuff that lives in this environment. We have fancy terms for this. The water is called the hydrosphere. The earth is called the geosphere. The atmosphere is called the atmosphere. And the living stuff is called the biosphere. Yeah, I'm never going to ask you, okay, define the geosphere. But you should have a functional knowledge of what these are, so that when we say the carbon is now in the geosphere, or the carbon dioxide just entered into the atmosphere, you're going to know what we're talking about as we're moving through these cycles. We're going to be looking at 4 different cycles in this chapter. The carbon cycle, this is the black molecule. We'll be looking at the water cycle, which is oxygen, H2O, oxygen, and 2 atoms of hydrogen. Then we'll be looking at the nitrogen cycle, and last but not least, the phosphorus cycle. Today, we are starting with the carbon cycle, so buckle up and let's dive in and see how carbon cycles through an ecosystem. There are 2 types of the carbon cycle that came up in the chapter. One is the geological carbon cycle, and then the second one is the biological carbon cycle. The geological carbon cycle describes how carbon moves from the crust of the earth up into the atmosphere and then down into the hydrosphere, back into the crust of the earth, and so on. All you need to know about this, we're not going to focus on it, but you should know that, number 1, this takes a very long time compared to the biological carbon cycle. The second thing you should know is that the vast majority of carbon on our planet is actually in the crust of the earth. It's in the rocks, the sedimentary rocks that make up the ground underneath our feet. This is released by weathering. So when that rock gets pushed to the surface and then the weather breaks it down, then that carbon gets released. It's also released through big events such as volcanic eruptions. They're constantly releasing carbon into the air in the form of carbon dioxide. So that's very basic. That's all you need to know about the geological carbon cycle. For the rest of our time, then, I'm going to focus on the biological carbon cycle, which describes the movement of carbon between living things and the atmosphere, or the water, if you happen to be a fish that lives in the water. As we talk about the biological carbon cycle, you're going to see a lot of similarities between this and the flow of energy that we did for the last couple of weeks. However, I want you to focus here on the carbon atoms. These are going to be the black atoms that are moving through this cycle. Carbon dioxide, which is in the atmosphere, is one of the molecules that is needed for photosynthesis. Let's write out our photosynthesis equation. For photosynthesis, we need carbon dioxide, which plants get from the atmosphere. We also need some H2O, which plants get from their roots. And then, of course, we need the sun. The sun is what provides the energy for this reaction to occur. So you take some carbon dioxide, some water, some sunlight, and you can produce glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen. So let's stop here and take a look at this formula. Notice the black carbon atoms. How many did you start with on the left-hand side of this equation? How many carbon atoms are present on the right-hand side of this equation? So wait a second. Matter cannot be created or destroyed, but we have 6 on the right side and only 1 on the left side. This is because actually when photosynthesis occurs, it uses 6 molecules of carbon dioxide along with 6 molecules of water and produces 1 molecule of glucose along with 6 molecules of O2. Now you'll notice there are 6 carbon atoms on the left side along with 6 carbon atoms on the right side. You could actually count all of the atoms and you will see they are the same on both sides of the equation. The only difference is now we have this extra energy from the sun, which is bound up in the glucose molecule on the right side of the equation. And then this glucose is used for the plants to grow themselves, and they build it into their different tissues, such as this little acorn on this oak tree. Along comes Mr. Deer, and he decides, hey, that acorn looks pretty good. I think I'm going to eat it. So the deer eats the acorn. Now that carbon has moved into the deer, where the deer uses it to make all sorts of tissue, such as fur, muscles, the fat. And of course, the deer also gets energy from consuming those glucose molecules. So this is why if you watch like a sci-fi movie, we're called carbon-based life forms. It's because carbon is part of almost every tissue of our body. Just because of the chemical makeup of carbon, it's able to combine to make tons and tons of different molecules. But now it's stuck in the deer. How does it get from the deer back into the atmosphere? Part of this occurs when we breathe. Let's go back to our photosynthesis equation. A deer does not undergo photosynthesis, so let's erase that. And then let's erase the sunlight and let's flip this arrow around. So what a deer does is it takes oxygen from the air, it takes the glucose from the food that it eats, and it burns these, much like that fire, but on a small scale, to release energy. And one of the byproducts of this reaction is carbon dioxide and water vapor get released when you breathe out. So let's review. The carbon dioxide starts here in the atmosphere. The tree uses the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to produce glucose. This glucose gets rearranged and reformed into many tissues throughout the tree so that when the deer comes along and eats that acorn, that carbon gets transferred to the deer. The deer uses this carbon to make all these components, the fur, the muscle, the fat. It also gets energy by breaking down that carbon-containing glucose molecule through the process of cellular respiration. It then breathes out that carbon dioxide, which is released back into the atmosphere to start this giant cycle all over again. This is the biological carbon cycle. Starting next week, we'll be taking a look at the other cycles, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle, to see how these other elements work their way through an ecosystem.